Welcome, Francesca, to the Security Unwired podcast, and thank you so much for making the time to talk about one of the most pressing matters. So, Francesca Bosco today with me is the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberPeace Institute, one of the most inspiring experts in international law and international human rights law. Francesca, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Francesca, you have worked on the intersection of cyberspace technology and peace and security. Pretty sure that most of our listeners now are really eager to see your point of views, especially given that right now we have a lot of ongoing conflicts, particularly ones that are lasting and that are escalating in time. And we've also seen growth and tendency in using cyber operations and cyber tools and methods for modern methods of warfare. This has been the case with Russia and also in Gaza and also with the escalation in Sudan. We've seen it everywhere. And this has shown me that the evolution of technology is actually growing in parallel with the escalation of conflict. So I'm really eager to know, what do you think motivates actors to sort of conduct these cyber operations in such and invest in them, particularly instead of the physical battlefield? So what do you think are the motives behind actors using cyber operations in warfare?
I think it's a complex landscape. And it's a combination of multiple factors. Let me start with, with the easy one in a way, which is we have to think in terms of like economics. So basically, if you think about it, cyber operations can have a disproportionate impact potentially with relatively low cost if you think about the physical operation. So compared with conventional warfare, cyber operations have a huge, in a way, return on investment. And in a way, low-cost inputs that can result potentially in outsized impact with relatively minimal resources. And I will also make a specific note when it comes also the type of actors that we have behind those type of operation can significantly, for example, inflict a disruption, sometimes even paralyzing basically critical infrastructure. Also, for example, widespread confusion. So this is specifically appealing for groups or states that might lack, in a way, the conventional military power. So that's also where let's say the economic incentives are relevant. There is a sort of like minimal operational risk, meaning cyber operations do not require the boots on the ground, right?
True.
And so there is no immediate risk of casualties, if you think about it, or loss of personnel, for example, which make these tactics, in a way, politically palatable and operationally attractive. One, let's say, more technical consideration is that obviously we've seen this across, let's say, different fields and not necessarily specifically in conflict, but there is an increased reliance on digital infrastructure. Hence, it's easier in a way to attack a critical infrastructure online, and so for military commanders, for example, conducting hybrid warfare represent a sort of like soft target in a way. And it can be a sort of like strategic target with a very quick win. And then what I was mentioning before in terms of like what cyber operations are leveraging is the asymmetrical capabilities, but also in a way low entry barriers. And this is related a little bit to what I was mentioning before in terms of like the type of actors. So nowadays, and let's face it, you don't need to be, let's say, a skilled, in a way, hacker anymore. Because you can, for example, hire cyber criminals. You can have tools, what we call as a service. So there is, as you very well know, a sort of like a criminal marketplace where you can, for example, buy or rent certain criminal type of tools and services or even infrastructure. I mean, notably, the first thing that comes to mind is ransomware as a service, for example, or, for example, off-the-shelf spyware.
Yes.
Like Pegasus or Predator. And so this is why it's also easier, in a way, to enter into this type of conflict. And then there's a consideration that is more related to again, a mix in between the technical dimension and the, I would say, the uptake when it comes to digital transformation of our society, which is the fact that data nowadays is to be considered a war asset. Because if you think about it, in modern conflict, data is a sort of like a strategic
a resource as well.
Exactly, because on one hand, the cyber operations facilitate intelligence gathering, espionage, surveillance of population, but also you can weaponize data themselves. And then there are also, I would say, and allow me to say this, and we've seen this specifically when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. You see a mix of different actors, like, for example, government, militaries, as well as civilian activist groups that are now caught in a sort of like arms race, or in a way race to the bottom, kind of like multipolar trap scenarios, whereby they are in a way forced, allow me to say, to expand into the digital front lines, using, for example, latest emerging technologies to account for the sort of like geopolitical rivalry and domestic pressure. And so this is where we see, for example, a heavier involvement of the what is called the civilian hackers, which has a lot to do also on what you were saying before in terms of like the hybrid warfare methodology.
Yes, and I think that at this point, technology, digital technology is accessible to everyone, whether state or non-state actor, which makes it even more possible for people to use it for cyber offense purposes. And I really understand the incentives, the economic incentives you mentioned, and the motives. But do you think is that these motives were originally the reasons behind this emergence of cyber warfare, but now perhaps is there a possibility that it's becoming more of a way to escape accountability, as in at some point we know that evidence can be hard to gather when it comes to the cyberspace for offense, for as in used in security but not for self-defense. This could be an example, or for being for even having cyber attacks for terrorist purposes. So all of these are possible. And do you think the accountability escape could be one of the motives?
It's a very intelligent question, because I think there are a couple of dimensions. So on one hand, we have to not necessarily, I would say, and this is why I made before the example of the, let's say, diversified type of actors that you have when we think about malicious actors in cyberspace. Not necessarily obviously there's a sort of like strategic thinking behind, but indeed I would say that when we think about which are those factors that might also, let's say, impact or facilitate, in a way, hybrid warfare. To your point on accountability, yes, I would say that the relative anonymity and also the jurisdictional complexity that we're facing now when we think about cyberspace can make it, in a way, a sort of like less accountable. And today, where the rules of engagement and also the mechanisms for accountability are still in a way catching up, because they're still transforming as well. Actors might basically leverage this sort of like a gray zone and feel that they can act with a sort of like sense of impunity. And if you think about it, unlike, for example, kinetic strikes, cyber attacks occur in a sort of like pretty murky, I would say, legal space, and attribution is still very difficult. It's often inconclusive, and so the problem is that you have a different frameworks. I'm thinking like the Geneva Conventions, the UN Charter. You have also, let's say, relatively recent initiatives like, for example, the Tallinn Manual, that, as we know, it's not binding. Experts are trying to define, let's say,
adapt as well.
Exactly, to adapt as well. But still, as you know, it's a sort of like uneven race. There is also another part. One of the most, I would say, significant advantage of cyber operation is the ability to mask one's identity. And unlike, if you think about it, a missile strike, for example, a cyber attack can be routed through multiple countries. For example, you can, going back to what I was mentioning before in terms of like the digital infrastructure, you can basically hijack infrastructure, leverage absolutely legitimate infrastructure. So it makes it extremely difficult basically to attribute responsibility with certainty. And again, I mean, coupling this with the sort of like regulatory gray zone, it's extremely difficult.
Absolutely. And given that the anonymous attackers have the possibility like to attack in different geographic locations and not restricted to only one, which means that the justice system really has to, in terms of adaptation in the justice system with cyber operations.
And that's very interesting what you mentioned, because I give you a practical example from reality. So one of the activity at the CyberPeace Institute, one of our key capability is to collect data related to cyber attacks and cyber operations, including disinformation campaigns, and basically show their impact. And we built three publicly available platforms, one dated back in COVID time, showing how cyber attacks were impacting hospitals and medical facilities. We recently launched the CyberPeace Tracer, which is monitoring the attacks against the civil society organizations. And because of the conflict in Ukraine, we developed a platform that is monitoring cyber attacks against the civilian infrastructure in the context of the Ukraine conflict. And initially, indeed, we started mapping the attacks, let's say, occurring or starting, I would say, between Russia and Ukraine. Immediately after, I mean, we understood that it was, let's say, too narrow, because immediately after we understood that the impact, but also the, I would say, other countries were leveraged, for example, for launching the attack. They were used as either primary or secondary target. So we had what you find now on the platform is also a sort of like much more comprehensive mapping exactly of the attacks, which is absolutely not exclusively related to the, let's say, the main countries in the conflict.
Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about impact, like based on your experience with cyber operations that have taken place, especially in the recent years with the recent developments in digital tech, how exactly do these cyber operations directly endanger civilians, civilian people, civilian objects, civilian infrastructure? So we talked about governmental infrastructures, which is directly related to public services that usually, such as healthcare, that usually civilians need in a time of conflict. So how exactly are these attacks affecting civilians in a context of a war that is much, much bigger than them?
Thank you so much for the question, because it's a topic, let's say, close to heart, but also it's the essence of what we do at the CyberPeace Institute. Is not only, again, the, let's say, the analytical dimension, but especially to expose the impact and harm that cyber attacks are having on society, notably on vulnerable communities. And I mean, as you said, if you think about it, civilians can be considered, let's say, the most vulnerable when it comes to a conflict context. And you already mentioned a clear let's say, impact. So the disruption of the functioning of critical infrastructure that are basically that they are providing basic essential services. Again, this is a very interesting observation that we had when it comes to the observation of the conflict in Ukraine, and notably the cyber dimension. Because if you remember, at the beginning of the conflict, many experts, let's say, were kind of like calling for waiting, let's say, for the big doomsday in a way. Mm-hmm. And after a while, there was this perception that, okay, cyber is not playing such a relevant role in the conflict. Well, actually, thanks also to observe to our platform and to monitor cyber attacks, we saw how cyber attacks were constant. And constant against, because Ukraine is a heavily digitized society, against civilian infrastructure, so public administration, for example. I mean, all of those services that were helping, let's say, society to function were impacted. And so, I mean, there is the physical impact, but then obviously there is also the dimension of exposing, obviously, the sensitive data of people, and specifically humanitarian data, because again, it's a sort of like double vulnerability that the civilians are facing in this circumstance, without even going to, to the extreme of refugees, activists, and humanitarian workers. Not only paralyzing or disrupting civilian infrastructure, but also, for example, the emergency response systems and all those systems put in place to deliver aid. And for example, disrupting also humanitarian operations as well. I remember that in the conflict, for example, previous conflict in Syria and Yemen, cyber attacks have been used, for example, to sabotage supply chains. And basically create the distrust among local population towards aid organizations. So and this is particularly relevant for the impact part, because it's not only what we, let's say, the immediate impact that we see, both in terms of like the physical impact, but also in terms of like, for example, as I mentioned before, the impact on sensitive data. But it's also, in a way, the more subtle and societal effect, which is, for example, exacerbating violence and displacement. This is done in two ways. On one hand, the continuous cyber attacks, but also coupling it, and this is a trend that we've seen particularly increasing in the context of the Ukraine conflict, which is coupling cyber attacks with disinformation campaigns. If you think about it, manipulating information and creating false narratives through, for example, cyber tools, adversaries can basically leverage this to escalate violence. And then a super important point, which is the psychological impact, meaning that unfortunately most of the count of the damages or reports on the data related to conflict, they still very much refer obviously to the physical dimension. And even when we talk about cyber attacks, we think in terms of how many devices were infected, or how much is the cost of repairing and recovering. At the CyberPeace Institute, since the very beginning, we understood that the societal cost and the societal impact and especially the harm the cyber attacks are causing is a much more complex. And so we develop a specific methodology. It's called the harms methodology, by which there are several dimensions to be considered, notably, and this is why I'm mentioning the psychological harm, because it's one of the most difficult to, let's say, to gather, but it's also very difficult because it's not immediate. So it might take some time, basically, to collect information about the psychological harm. And think about also what is, and this is why I mentioned in the long term, is, for example, the effect when it comes to the loss of trust. When civilians lose trust, for example, in who is supposed to help them, like
as a society,
aid organization, but also in digital systems that are meant to protect or help them, like I'm thinking like registration systems, relief tracking. So what we were
family
mentioning before,
and
exactly. The resulting uncertainty can lead to panic, exacerbate also social division, and basically provoking chaos. And then indeed, there is a sort of like what I was mentioning before in terms of like heightened vulnerability, meaning that on top of facing physical attacks, they also fear that data can be stolen, manipulated, let's say more unreachable from time to time, because they decide to disconnect basically.
Because of the loss of
yes,
trust.
exactly. So that's why I'm saying it's a very complex environment, specifically when we want to measure the harm and the impact that cyber operations are having in a sort of like hybrid warfare context.
Yeah, you mentioned something about building false narrative, and I think two out of many ways that we see nowadays in cyber warfare that contribute to false narrative is either direct misinformation campaigns that are designed to change narrative, or there's also internet shutdowns and shutdowns of power grids that kind of disconnect people at a certain specific time with strategic purposes and systemic reasons behind it, in order to stop basically the truth from coming out. And we've seen this, like you said earlier, about not having it necessarily always constant, even the disruption every 1 month, every 2 months, month can have both physical and psychological impact. We've seen it particularly in Gaza with the lack of infrastructure to have access to what had happened at a specific date and time.
Yeah.
Sometimes we only find out about something the day after because in that specific area there wasn't any internet connection. And back to mis and disinformation campaigns. I mean, they are used deliberately sometimes, and sometimes they it's just a loss of control of technology. But like from a legal perspective, perhaps, how exactly can the international humanitarian law consider this sort of particular cyber operation a crime, perhaps in warfare or digital space, if it's affecting civilians negatively?
So that's a very tricky question, and I think it's relevant what you mentioned, meaning we have cases of mis and disinformation that are used basically deliberately to change the local narrative, manipulate, or in some cases kind of like mislead the civilians. I mean, we had cases like, for example, misleading civilians in terms of like the location of the aid, the delivery, the safety of a particular area, for example, for the civilian population, but then it might also be a sort of like spillover effect. Given the fact that international humanitarian law does apply to cyber operations during armed conflict, including those that manipulate or disrupt information to mislead the civilian or humanitarian actors. However, I would say that for cyber operation and specifically the spread of disinformation, it's a little bit complex because to be considered an attack, as you know, or violation under the IHL, it must basically meet a certain threshold. And that's where it's becoming, let's say, complex, because according to state practice and legal commentary, IHL defines a cyber attack as an operation reasonably expected to cause injury or death to person or damage or damage or destruction to objects, including the disabling of international digital systems, of essential digital systems, even if no physical damage occurs. The problem is that when you consider cyber operation targeting, for example, humanitarian organizations or civilian that result in such effect, it can be considered an unlawful attack under the IHL, but the cyber operations that only in this context that involve the manipulation of information without resulting in the direct harm or disruption to essential services may fall below the threshold. So this is why, and you will hear me repeating this, but the evolving nature of the cyber conflict, even though we have let's say, establish international human rights law, international humanitarian law that apply, but means that the legal community is actively debating and clarifying and always needs to keep up to date in terms of like how to adapt legal instruments to the current nature of what we see in terms of like evolution of technology on one hand, specifically cyber operations.
The evolution is what's tricky when it has to be in parallel with the methods of digital warfare and with the accountability in international human rights law and humanitarian law. And I know that adapting the systems can be tricky, but in your experience, have you seen any particular systemic risks that you've encountered that the humanitarian law or international human rights law have no power over in terms of accountability? I'm curious because I know like the examples you've mentioned in Ukraine are obviously considered systemic risks behind the infrastructure and everything. But how do usually international frameworks, because it's been like the war in Ukraine has been like in a while now, and how so far has the international frameworks perhaps progressed or developed their essence in order to adapt to these systemic risks, to identify them, to know how to respond to them?
Okay, allow me to maybe to dissect it to two areas here, starting from, let's say, the last point. I mentioned it before, but it's super important. International human rights law and international humanitarian law provide the essential frameworks for protecting, for example, civilians and upholding rights in digital space, but their effectiveness, I would say, so a little bit what I was mentioning before, we have the right, in a way, tools, but at the same time, the effectiveness is challenged by I would say, the unique characteristics of cyber and allow me to say also AI, and I will come back to this, driven warfare in a way. There are also, ongoing processes. I'm thinking about the UN open-ended working group that just finished the most recent cycle, is finishing the most recent cycle this week in New York, had the the open-ended working group with also the multi-stakeholder dimension has made an important strides in encouraging countries, for example, to adopt international norms governing cyber attacks and protecting also critical infrastructure from attack. However, I would say that humanitarian operations and civilian infrastructure are still often targeted in cyber attacks, and international frameworks remain, in a way, insufficiently protective in this domain. And again, before we were talking about attribution, still, let's say, I would say the elephant in the room, and even exacerbated by the use of AI,
yes,
obviously. So I would say there are some recent development. I mean, notably, I'm thinking about the recent ICRC effort when it comes to the in response to the rising cyber threats in armed conflict. The ICRC proposed 8 principles, for example, to help ensure civilian protection in cyberspace based on international humanitarian law. So there are, according to your question, in terms of like, is the international law trying to, let's say, to keep up and adapt? Absolutely, yes. Are we at a sort of like critical point and critical results? Unfortunately, not yet. Even starting from, I mean, still the challenge that when we talk about cyber attack, we are not meaning the same thing. So that's why I'm saying it's, let's say, it's still a long way to go. When, I mean, covering the other part of the question, which is, which are those systemic risks, I would start with let's say, with the immediate one, which is indeed the, not only the rapid improvement and application of AI of AI technology, but also what we still don't know in a way about AI, thinking about agentic AI. Yes, exactly. So this is definitely something that the international community has, specifically when we think about the humanitarian and the conflict context, is still, let's say, trying to define and keep up with. Another good example, but I mean a very sad is, yes, exactly, the autonomous weapon. So the deployment of AI-powered autonomous weapon systems in military operation pose significant threats, and the impact on civilians obviously raise concerns for accountability and the ethical implication also of autonomous decision making. I'm thinking then also about when it comes to systemic risk, again, the use of AI in specific circumstances, like, for example, I'm thinking about border security. So in conflict or post-conflict areas, AI tools for border security, or for example, for refugee management, may inadvertently perpetuate bias. I did some work on this in the past, specifically about AI-driven, for example, profiling systems that are used in border control or refugee registration, can unfortunately be targeting unwillingly, but still targeting, for example, vulnerable groups based on race, ethnicity. And then again, another systemic risk is what we were mentioning before in terms of disinformation. Again, let's say coupling misinformation and psychological warfare with AI, and I'm thinking about, for example, AI generated deepfakes, obviously can manipulate the media, create false narratives. In Syria, for example, disinformation campaigns have used AI tools to create both fake images and videos of atrocities, for example, to further escalate basically the tensions. And again, this has an impact both on civilians, but also on those organizations that are trying to help.
Yeah, which was going to actually lead me to my next question about because when you talk about the examples you just mentioned about border security, for example, in post-conflict time or in refugee camps, etc., obviously we don't have just civilians that are affected, but also we have humanitarian actors and organizations, whether local or international, both, of course. And I'm pretty sure that they have been just as threatened by these risks. And I'm wondering, especially in the dimension of local international organization, we know that they have sometimes different resources, different power over the people taking control of the conflict or the post-conflict area. So how are the risks really evolving between these two different types of humanitarian actors?
I would say the methods might be very common. but the impact might be very different. So when it comes to common methods, just briefly mentioning maybe some of the most common type of cyber attacks tactics, still I would say, and again, I mean, this is also part of the work that we've been doing, both in assisting civil society organizations and humanitarian organizations that might be, as you very well said, also under-resourced in boosting their cybersecurity capabilities. And also we are monitoring cyber attacks against these organizations. So I would say that from a technical standpoint, still malware and ransomware are the type of like most prevailing type of attacks. Still what I would call a traditional type of attacks like phishing and social engineering attacks are still very successful. You have examples of distributed denial of service attacks. Attacking, for example, often used to attack, for example, international organizations. I'm thinking about like the High Commissioner for Refugees, data breaches and exfiltration. The unfortunate case of the Red Cross, it's pretty famous. So you have this sort of like more usual type of threats. You have then the AI powered ones, and this is a little bit what we were mentioning before. AI is increasingly used, for example, to automate some of the part of the kill chain. So, for example, targeted discovery, improve social engineering techniques. We have before I mentioned malware and ransomware, so enhanced, AI enhanced ransomware, for example, increased targeted misinformation and disinformation campaigns, the use of espionage. What I think it's interesting is exactly what you are mentioning. So the difference between, let's say, big and small organizations, they might have a different in resources. What I think it's a common trait is that one of the problems that I see is that in most of the cases, obviously, as a humanitarian organization, you prioritize giving help and not thinking necessarily about securing the organization, securing the data.
Yes.
But this might lead not only to the impact on the organization, but also to the impact of the data of the beneficiaries, for example, and ultimately putting also the beneficiary at risk, thinking, for example, about surveillance technologies and the spyware that we mentioned before. So the problem that I see is that still there is, on one hand, sort of like a gap in resources, but then on the other hand, we need to enhance even the awareness and the fact that those organizations might be subject to attack. And also, allow me to say, there is another dimension, which is a little bit what I was mentioning before in terms of like also the evolution of the threat actors, meaning that historically, I mean, civil society organization might have been attacked mostly by cyber criminals because they were interested in their money and their data, or in very specific cases, for example, in terms of like political dissidents, obviously for more form of like surveillance and control. But we see increasingly how state and non-state actors are targeting humanitarian organizations, again, both to disrupt their operations, but also often as a matter of like, as a method of control. And so the ecosystem is becoming extremely complex.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, especially from a humanitarian point of view. And just to add on that, I know that besides humanitarian organizations and actors, also activists and journalists have also been affected by, like for instance, in Sudan, there have been even imported spywares from different states, not necessarily the people acting in the warfare alone, and supporting basically the rapid support forces in order to target these activists and change narrative and possibly even escalate the conflict. So it's really something to consider. But now that we're talking about civil society, how are the civil society actors now recently trying at least to step up in the digital resilience when it comes to, it could be about documenting these cyber attacks and trying to gather evidence, or about the security side of it, or the capacity building for the staff that work in these humanitarian organizations, to show them that it is a responsibility not only for their own safety but the safety of the civilians. I'm really eager to know what have you seen so far as something promising announcing perhaps something inspiring, including the work of CyberPeace Institute, of course.
So let me start maybe with a general reflection on how civil society can contribute. So you already named a super important one, which is documenting cyber harms and vulnerabilities. Also, because I often say we are the one that are closing the gap, right? So closing to the last mile, basically. And so this is super important, and also helping in responding basically to cyber harms and building resilience. And I can tell you also a little bit what do we do at the CyberPeace Institute. A little bit also what I was mentioning before in terms of raising awareness, because we're not there yet. So raising awareness both about the risk and the harm that cyber attacks and disinformation are causing, but also in terms of, like, for example, advocating for digital rights, and this within the civil society community, but also, for example, when it comes to policymakers. And here I make a specific parenthesis, because how much there is a big debate, and especially in this pivotal year where we have the open-ended working group that is coming to an end, and also we had a multi-stakeholder discussion like at the IGF. So how a civil society organization can contribute, basically, well, they have a crucial role because they are the ones that can provide, in a way, evidence-based knowledge, and they are the ones that are closer, I would say, to what is really happening in society, and to improve policies. Obviously, you need to, in a way, invest the human capital and also actual resources where the impact is the most, and where the and where specifically vulnerable communities are impacted. So absolutely, there is a clear role. The civil society organization also have been pretty active, I would say, in, for example, the open-ended working group that I was mentioning before, but also in several other international high-level processes. And I think that the interesting part regarding civil society organization is also the joining forces dimension. I think that the power of civil society is that more and more you see how also across different fields we are joining forces. I give you a practical example. Last year, and again going back to firms believe that digital resilience is at the basis of not only the survival of organizations, but also obviously the a sustainable development component, together with civil society organizations that have a very different mandate from I'm thinking like Médecins Sans Frontières, I'm thinking WaterAid, I'm thinking those organizations that are both active in development and the humanitarian context. We kind of like signed a joint call, a letter signed by several CEOs of civil society organizations, asking, basically calling their donors and, donors in general, like private philanthropies, public institution, and also the corporate sector, to prioritize cybersecurity and to help them prioritize in cybersecurity when delivering the support. So there are different forms of like joining forces, which is pretty, I think, encouraging when it comes to civil society. And there is also, some very, let's say, concrete actions. When I was mentioning before, what we do at the CyberPeace Institute, and going back to documenting attacks. For example, we supported the Human Rights Center in Berkeley in making an appeal to the ICC when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, providing digital evidence according to the data that we were collecting in the case of the Ukraine conflict. What we can do in practice, what I was mentioning before in terms of like building resilience, we have a specific program that is called the CyberPeace Builders, by which we are supporting for free civil society organizations across the globe. with the pre and post incident, let's say, support. But now we are also thinking about developing an actual SOC, so a security operations centers that would help also in the case of an incident. So while the incident is occurring, so there is on one hand the need to better understand the threat and to basically to advocate based on what is really happening to people and how cyber attacks are really impacting people. But then on the other hand, the so what, meaning, okay, we know this, then how we can help. And there is one dimension, which is the CyberPeace Builders program, so providing direct support. But then, for example, we also have the CyberPeace Academy, by which we are providing capacity building offering to civil society organizations and also to a certain extent to other under-resourced organizations. And for example, one of the latest offering that we develop is the AI Skills for All, specifically devoted to improving AI skills in civil society organization. There is also the when it comes to the AI dimension, for example, we are devoting specifically from this year onwards. We are launching soon the revised version, let's say, of our AI for CyberPeace, which includes both trying to understand how AI is impacting and disrupting the cyber threat landscape, but also on the other hand, how AI can be used in a responsible way by those organizations also to protect themselves from cyber threats. When I was mentioning before let's say the joining forces, I have one specific initiative in mind and that I'm very excited about. Cybersecurity is a strange, let's say, is a strange field because historically has been dominated mostly by, I would say, by state and private sector companies that are key actors to collaborate with, but the CyberPeace Institute is sort of like a strange animal in the system because with very few others, we have cybersecurity at the core, let's say, of our mandate. And for example, with other civil society organizations that are working, and non-profit, that are working on cybersecurity, we created a coalition that is called Nonprofit Cyber, by which we are also, and you can find the information on the website, we also basically publish all the services that we develop for free for the community. So it's a good resource. But then we also kind of like level up in terms of we really understood the need to advocate for cybersecurity as a common good. And so we created one initiative that is called Common Good Cyber. Common Good Cyber is really calling for protecting the backbone of the internet, the backbone of the infrastructure we all rely upon, and those organizations that are basically creating, well, securing the digital infrastructure, but also creating this digital resilience for all, in most of the cases as a non-profit. And thanks to this sort of like a battle, we also managed that Canada, in the latest G7 meeting and the UK specifically endorsed and committed to the Common Good Cyber Fund that will be launched in the second part of the year. And other donors and supporters are joining, which is a tangible result of how civil society has a key role to play when it comes to digital resilience in conflict and in peace. How much we can have an impact if we get together, and how much we need to collaborate, obviously, with, for example, with the private sector, with public institutions, really to benefit all.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to all these initiatives, and I hope that the people actors from multiple disciplines will also be eager to engage with these tools and these initiatives. And I love the fact that you emphasize on joining forces, because I've seen that sometimes it's been quite challenging for people to collaborate from different disciplines, technologists, activists, governmental actors, and civil society, and even media at some point, they have also very, very significant role if they collaborate with civil society. And it has been challenging in terms of aligning priorities, but I have also seen some successful initiatives, and also like CyberPeace is one of them. It's showing that it is possible for people with different backgrounds, but a same vision to collaborate and to work together for a more peaceful cyberspace.
And allow me to say, I mean, I think you're striking a super important point, which is there is a one angle, which is from time to time not even knowing that maybe that this initiative exists. So this is why I specifically thank you for the opportunity. But again, in whole also, I always say meaningful collaboration. So it's not enough to have a partnership collaboration, but meaningful collaboration, because this is where we can help each other, where we are basically using our best capabilities and kind of like filling the gap instead of like duplicating or overlapping and depleting the resources, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been really inspiring listening to you talk about all of this. Quite frankly, these are times where we need to leverage technology and the knowledge and capacities in tech and AI for the greater good. And that is why even Security Unwired's main vision is tech with intent and peace with purpose, which brings me back to having a same vision, a common vision, perhaps different tools, different mindsets, but we're all aiming for the same vision. Thank you so much, Francesca. This has been so lovely.
Thank you.